During Nero's night games, prisoners were drenched in pitch and burned alive as human torches. Just one of the favorite tortures Rome's cruelest emperors engineered. This wasn't madness, it was policy. So who allowed Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus to turn execution, humiliation, and secret torture chambers into tools of government? Chronicles glorize their reigns. The legal edicts, bone trauma, and arena records expose the truth. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Rome entered the imperial age with the illusion that law, lex, senatus, mos maiorum, would restrain the ruler. But under the emperors we are about to confront, law didn't restrain power. Law codified cruelty, protected it, financed it, and turned it into political theatre. These men were not outliers in a stable system. They were the system. Nero set the template. His spectacles of fire after the Great Fire of 64 CE were not bursts of insanity, but carefully staged punishments meant to shift blame, display dominance, and terrify opponents. Tacitus tells us how victims were skinned, torn by dogs, nailed to crosses, or burned in his gardens while elite guests dined among the flames. The horror wasn't hidden, it was choreographed. By transforming execution into decoration, Nero proved that violence could be repackaged as entertainment, and entertainment could be weaponized as imperial legitimacy. Caligula refined the script by turning cruelty into comedy. Under his reign, laughter became a warning. Senators were humiliated publicly before being dragged to execution. Guests were murdered during meals. When the arena lost momentum, Caligula ordered whole sections of the crowd thrown to the beasts, simply to keep the blood flowing. His favorite torture wasn't a device, it was unpredictability, terror that arrived without logic, without warning, and without limit. Domitian shifted the cruelty behind doors. He understood that silence instills fear more efficiently than spectacle. His preferred torture was not fire or beasts, but secrecy. Interrogation chambers with no witnesses, treason trials that weaponized words and glances, and a network of informers who turned everyday speech into a lethal risk. His brutality didn't scream, it whispered, smothering Rome in paranoia. Then came Commodus, who dissolved what remained of imperial dignity. Unlike Nero or Domitian, he wanted the blood to fall directly at his feet. He strutted into the arena dressed as a gladiator, killing bound men and helpless animals as citizens were forced to applaud. This wasn't entertainment, it was domination disguised as sport. Under Commodus, cruelty stopped being a tool of governance and became a personal indulgence. The emperor's favorite game. 4 emperors, 4 styles. One truth: torture was not an accident of character. It was the architecture of imperial power. Fire, humiliation, secrecy, and staged bloodshed were not deviations from Roman governance. They were Roman governance. And now we begin to answer the central question of this investigation. How did Rome turn its most sadistic emperors into instruments of state? And why did a civilization built on law choose fear as its true constitution? The Great Fire of 64 CE did more than destroy Rome. It revealed how a ruler weaponizes catastrophe. 3 of 14 districts reduced to ashes, 7 more damaged. A capital choking on smoke, suspicion, and rumor. In that chaos, Nero discovered something every authoritarian eventually learns. Disaster is not a setback. Disaster is an opportunity, and pain, when directed, becomes policy. Ancient sources differ on whether Nero ignited the fire to clear space for his golden house, the extravagant Domus Aurea, but the more revealing truth lies not in who started the blaze, but in who paid for it. Rome's reconstruction required legitimacy, funds, and a scapegoat. Nero found all three by engineering one of the most calculated persecution campaigns in early imperial history. Christians, small, isolated, disliked, were ideal. The public already distrusted them for refusing to participate in Roman religious rituals. Nero merely amplified what society was primed to believe. His accusation didn't need evidence. It needed theatre, and he supplied it in full. Tacitus's account in Annals 44 tells us precisely how the machine operated. Victims were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were nailed to crosses. Many were coated in pitch and burned alive as lamps in Nero's gardens. These weren't spontaneous punishments. They were staged events requiring carpenters, handlers, fire managers, guards, executioners, suppliers, and administrators. Proof that the empire already had a functioning logistics chain for mass suffering. The brutality served three purposes. First, it redirected public rage away from Nero and toward an expendable group. Second, it created a spectacle so overwhelming that dissent felt pointless. And third, it re-established Nero as the arbiter of life and death, an emperor whose authority glowed as brightly as the bodies burning in his gardens. Behind each execution lay a bureaucratic armature more chilling than the flames themselves. Imperial slaves documented the proceedings. Arena accountants tracked the number of animals used, the quantities of pitch consumed, the wages of handlers, the cost of crosses, the food required to keep prisoners alive long enough to die in the proper sequence. Violence was not a chaotic spasm, it was an institution. This is where the political psychology of Nero's reign becomes visible. Cruelty in Rome was not simply inflicted, it was administered. The state didn't merely allow torture, it regulated it, funded it, and embedded it into the civic identity. To kill publicly required public resources. To burn humans as entertainment required an entire marketplace. Even the location mattered. Nero's executions often took place in his private gardens, but were deliberately made public, turning elite dinner guests into witnesses and participants in imperial cruelty. Guests who recoiled were marked. Guests who laughed were safe. Guests who admired Nero's theatrics climbed socially. What looked like entertainment was actually loyalty testing. Nero also blurred the line between spectacle and surveillance. By making the executions highly visible, he reminded Rome that he alone controlled who lived, who died, and who burned. Public torture functioned like a mass message. If I can do this to them, imagine what I can do to you. The uncertainty whether the emperor's next target would be Christians, nobles, senators, or even his own family was part of the design. That design reached into the Senate as well. Nero's forced suicides of senators were not secret murders. They were psychological displays. Rome's elite watched colleagues die not because they committed crimes, but because they had become inconvenient. The message traveled faster than any decree. In Nero's Rome, loyalty was irrelevant. What mattered was the emperor's mood, and his mother, Agrippina, proved that even proximity to power offered no protection. The collapsed ceiling, the sabotaged boat, and finally the cold execution that ended her life showed that Nero's violence was not limited to outsiders. Anyone, even the architect of his rise, could be erased. The Great Fire and the aftermath were simply the most visible stage on which Nero perfected this system. But its deeper function was administrative. Once fear became normalized, once executions became spectacles, once the logistics of cruelty became standardized, the machinery of imperial domination no longer required Nero's presence. It could run on its own. This is how an empire shifts from rule by law to rule by dread. After the fire, Rome did not rebuild merely its structures. It rebuilt its hierarchy of terror. Nero only set the example. The system he constructed, the expectation that public pain reinforces imperial control, became a template for those who followed him. And this brings us to the question that will drive us deeper into Act 2. If Nero needed a catastrophe to justify mass torture, what would happen when a ruler no longer needed justification at all? When cruelty itself became the entertainment, the currency, and the philosophy of governance? To answer that, we must leave the blaze behind and turn to the man who transformed murder into mockery, Caligula. If Nero proved that terror could be staged, Caligula proved it could be laughed at. His reign from 37 to 41 CE exposed something far darker than madness: the political utility of humiliation. Caligula didn't simply kill. He ridiculed, mocked, teased, and performed cruelty as if it were a joke shared with the gods. And Rome learned quickly that when the emperor laughed, someone else would bleed. To understand Caligula's psychology, one must first understand the expectation he inherited. After the slow, suffocating end of Tiberius, an emperor remembered more for paranoia than spectacle. Rome desperately wanted a ruler who felt alive. Caligula delivered that energy, but what Rome interpreted as vitality was merely volatility. A ruler who cannot be predicted is more dangerous than a ruler who is cruel. Cruelty at least follows a logic. Caligula followed appetite. Suetonius paints him as a man who tested loyalty through absurdity. The Senate was not a deliberative body, but an audience forced to applaud his improvisations. Trials were scripted in advance, the guilt predetermined. Caligula would summon senators not for governance, but for humiliation, insulting them publicly, inventing treason charges on a whim, or demanding impossible vows of devotion. The point was never justice. The point was domination, performed through farce. His dinners became a theatre of death. Cassius Dio describes moments when, mid-feast, Caligula signalled a guard, and a guest was dragged away and executed in the next room. The remaining diners were ordered to continue eating. Some choked, others trembled, but none dared stop. Caligula watched their reactions the way a playwright studies an audience, adjusting his performance to maximize discomfort. This was not madness. This was surveillance disguised as festivity. In the arena, his cruelty shifted from private joke to public policy. When the games slowed, when too few criminals remained to keep the spectacle bloody, Caligula simply ordered entire sections of the audience thrown to the beasts. Not criminals, not prisoners, ordinary Romans. Their only crime was boredom. Their deaths reminded the city that the emperor's pleasure outweighed the value of any life. Notice the pattern emerging. Nero used torture to redirect blame. Caligula used it to erase the boundary between citizen and victim. Under Caligula, anyone could die at any moment for any reason, or for no reason at all. That unpredictability was the torture. Women of the highest status were not exempt. Senators' wives were summoned, inspected, violated, or paraded as objects of scorn. Afterwards, their husbands were forced to thank the emperor for his interest. Gender became another arena for Caligula's sadism. Patriarchs who once ruled households by Roman law now watched their authority inverted, their families displayed as trophies of imperial privilege. But behind the theatrics lay an economy that kept the cruelty running. Caligula's extravagant spending on games, banquets, and spectacles drained the treasury. To refill it, he resurrected or invented taxes, including levies on lawsuits, marriages, and even prostitution. Confiscations of property became routine. Accusations of treason conveniently enriched the imperial coffers. Every execution created both fear and revenue. Every humiliation reinforced hierarchy and funded the next display. Caligula's sadism was not random, it was monetized. This is where his comedy becomes legible as statecraft. By making cruelty funny, at least to himself, he destroyed the possibility of shared moral judgment. After all, how do you protest an atrocity that the emperor presents as a joke? How do you resist a ruler who treats his victims as punchlines? Caligula weaponized absurdity. Reason could not contain him, which meant no legal argument could restrain him. His erratic behavior was not weakness, it was armor. But unpredictability has a cost. While Nero's victims illuminated gardens, Caligula's victims illuminated truth. A ruler who destabilizes the entire social order becomes vulnerable from every direction. The Praetorian Guard, senators, and even members of his own court eventually concluded that survival required eliminating the source of chaos. When Caligula's body was pierced again and again in the palace corridor, Rome briefly exhaled, not out of righteousness, but exhaustion. Yet the system that enabled him did not die with him. His reign proved something foundational, that public humiliation can be as effective a tool of power as public bloodshed. Nero taught Rome that fear could be engineered. Caligula taught Rome that fear could be performed. Which brings us to the next evolution of imperial control, one that removed laughter entirely. If Caligula mastered unpredictability, Domitian mastered silence. And silence has its own brutality. Before we enter those sealed chambers, we must confront a question that Caligula's reign leaves hanging. What happens when the emperor no longer needs spectacle at all? When fear can be administered without witnesses, without crowds, without sound? The answer waits in the quiet corridors of Domitian's Rome. Caligula ruled through chaos. Nero ruled through spectacle. But Domitian, reigning from 81 to 96 CE, ruled through something far more suffocating: silence. His cruelty did not roar in the arena or crackle in the flames of night games. It lived in rooms without windows, interrogations without witnesses, accusations without sound. Under Domitian, Rome entered a new political climate, one where fear no longer needed to be seen to be effective. To understand Domitian's system, imagine a Rome where every conversation feels like a confession, where even a raised eyebrow can be construed as treason, where citizens walk past the imperial palace and feel it listening back. That was Domitian's gift to the empire, a reign of perfect paranoia. While Nero and Caligula embraced spectacle, Domitian distrusted it. Public violence was unpredictable. Crowds could react unpredictably. Humor, mockery, applause, these were vulnerabilities. Domitian wanted a world where no reaction was possible. And so, he built a machinery of control that functioned best when its gears were hidden. He began by reviving and expanding maiestas, Rome's treason laws. Under earlier emperors, treason was tied to action. Plots, rebellions, conspiracies. Under Domitian, treason became atmospheric. A word spoken with the wrong tone, a hesitation in greeting the emperor, a statue of him not sufficiently worshipped. Even silence, yes, literal silence, could imply dissent. Tacitus and Suetonius describe a Rome where citizens learned to fear their own thoughts. But the brilliance of Domitian's cruelty lay not in its punishments, but in its architecture. He created an ecosystem of informers, delatores, who prospered by accusing others. Each accusation was rewarded with money, land, or political favor. Under Nero, cruelty flowed downward from the emperor. Under Domitian, cruelty spread sideways, from citizen to citizen, until no one could tell whether their neighbor was a friend or a future accuser. Fear became decentralized, and that is the most durable kind. The interrogation rooms, unnamed, unrecorded, but referenced again and again in ancient sources, were the heart of this architecture. They were not chambers of physical spectacle, they were chambers of psychological extraction. Domitian understood that torture did not need an audience to be effective. Torture needed only two ingredients: secrecy and uncertainty. Senators, equestrians, and nobles, groups traditionally shielded from the harshest punishments, found themselves dragged into these rooms. Roman law historically limited torture primarily to slaves. Domitian annihilated that barrier. Nobles could now be beaten, stretched, starved, burned, or mutilated, not for information, but for obedience. Each scream that no one heard reinforced a political truth. The emperor had abolished the hierarchy that once protected Rome's elite. This was not madness. It was mathematics. By weaponizing silence, Domitian achieved what other emperors could not. He eliminated the distinction between public and private fear. Under Nero, one could fear the arena. Under Caligula, one could fear meals and laughter. Under Domitian, one feared everything. Pliny the Younger later wrote that during Domitian's reign, no man dared to speak his thoughts. That sounds poetic. It is actually clinical. The emperor had constructed a society where the safest political position was muteness. And when people stop speaking, they also stop organizing, resisting, or imagining alternatives. Domitian did not merely punish treason, he prevented the conditions in which dissent could be born. Even the palace reflected this ideology. Unlike Nero's pleasure gardens or Caligula's extravagant banquet halls, Domitian's palaces were described as immaculate, polished, and eerily quiet. Servants moved carefully. Guards spoke minimally. Visitors approached with rehearsed phrases. The emperor liked order, and that order radiated outward into the city. Predictable, rigid, suffocating. Because his violence was hidden, it had a second chilling effect. Disappearance became a political weapon. People simply vanished. No trial, no announcement, no body. The absence itself became the message. If Nero's victims illuminated his gardens, Domitian's victims illuminated nothing. They were extinguished, and the darkness emphasized his control. The Senate, once a deliberative institution, disintegrated under this pressure. Senators became hollowed-out figures, preserving their titles while losing their agency. They debated nothing, resisted nothing, decided nothing. Their silence was not consensus. It was survival. By the time Domitian was assassinated in 96 CE, killed by palace officials with the secret support of his wife, Rome was starving for sound. The Senate immediately condemned his memory through damnatio memoriae. Statues destroyed, names erased, portraits smashed. This wasn't moral cleansing. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim the public self. Rome had lost in those years of whispering fear. Yet, the irony cannot be ignored. The Senate erased Domitian's image, but preserved his system. The laws of treason remained potent. The culture of accusation persisted. The idea that an emperor's power thrives in silence would echo into later reigns. Which brings us to the final descent into imperial sadism. A ruler who took the tools of Nero, the volatility of Caligula, and the silence of Domitian, and inverted them. Domitian hid cruelty, Commodus performed it, and he made Rome watch. Before we enter the arena where the emperor himself demanded applause, we must confront the question Domitian leaves behind. If an emperor can control a population through silence, what happens when that same emperor seeks not obedience, but spectacle? When he demands not fear alone, but admiration for his violence? The arena awaits. If Nero weaponized spectacle, and Caligula weaponized mockery, and Domitian weaponized silence, then Commodus, reigning from 180 to 192 CE, weaponized something far more corrosive: self-worship. Under him, cruelty stopped being an instrument of governance and became an instrument of ego. Rome entered a new phase of imperial sadism, one where the emperor did not simply order torture, he performed it. Commodus inherited an empire exhausted by war, corruption, and Domitian's suffocating paranoia. Rome hoped for stability under the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. What they received instead was a ruler who believed the empire existed to validate his fantasies. Marcus Aurelius had written meditations on duty and restraint. Commodus rewrote the calendar to name months after himself. His favorite stage was not the Senate, not the palace, not the treasury. It was the arena. And once he stepped into it dressed as a gladiator, the hierarchy that defined Roman political life collapsed. Commodus blurred the line between emperor and entertainer, citizen and captive, life and sport. In doing so, he inverted every Roman ideal about dignity, law, and the sacred character of imperial office. Ancient sources, especially Cassius Dio, record that Commodus claimed to have fought hundreds of matches. But these were not contests. They were demonstrations of domination. His opponents were wounded beforehand, unarmed, or explicitly ordered to submit. Some were tied to platforms. Some were forced to fall theatrically. To resist him was to die. To perform submission was to survive. He slaughtered animals in the same way. On one day alone, he reportedly killed 100 lions. He decapitated ostriches and paraded with their dripping heads. He even killed a giraffe, a creature no Roman had ever seen as dangerous, simply because it made the crowd gasp. For Commodus, these killings were not demonstrations of bravery. They were reminders that his pleasure overruled all logic. But behind the theatrics, the cruelty had an administrative core. For the arena to become his personal playground, the bureaucracy had to provide victims, animals, armor, handlers, stage crews, and guards. The state treasury funded these indulgences. The Senate could not object. Dissent meant death. Commodus executed one senator simply for laughing at the wrong moment during a performance. Another was killed after criticizing the emperor's Roman Hercules persona. Under Domitian, silence had been mandatory. Under Commodus, applause was mandatory. This is how the emperor's narcissism became political. The games were not entertainment, they were compulsion. Citizens were forced to watch, forced to cheer, forced to participate in the fiction that the emperor was a divine hero. Resistance was treason. Indifference was treason. Even fear could be treason if Commodus interpreted it as insult. His costumes amplified this ideology. He dressed as Hercules, wearing lion skins and carrying a club, demanding worship, not as emperor, but as demigod. Statues were recarved to resemble him. Decrees referenced him as the Roman Hercules. The empire's symbolic order, its myths, its legends, its history, was rewritten to fit the ego of one man. This was not eccentricity. It was imperial rebranding through violence. Commodus's gladiatorial fantasies corroded what remained of Rome's political structure. Senators once pretended to advise emperors. Now they pretended to admire his kills. The Praetorian Guard once protected the emperor. Now they protected the audience from the emperor. Gladiators, criminals, animals, civilians. Everyone in the arena's orbit existed merely as props. His reign also exposed the economic fragility of an empire built on spectacle. Commodus spent enormous sums on games, gifts, and grandiose displays. To finance them, he increased taxes, seized estates, and executed wealthy citizens to confiscate their assets. Cruelty became a form of revenue extraction. Every death served two purposes: entertainment and enrichment. By the late 180s, governance had hollowed out completely. Ministers ruled in the background while Commodus posed in the arena. Corruption flourished. Rome became a theatre state, literally. The emperor's narcissistic performances replaced law, strategy, and administration. This breakdown of legitimacy produced the final twist in Commodus's story. His death was not a rebellion, it was a management decision. Members of his inner circle, including his mistress and the Praetorian prefect, concluded that the empire could not survive another year of his games. They poisoned him. When the poison failed, they sent in an athlete, the same type of performer Commodus loved to humiliate. He was strangled on the last day of 192 CE, killed by the hands of a man who had trained to entertain him. The Senate's reaction was instantaneous relief. They declared him a public enemy, erased his name, and restored the months he had renamed. Statues were smashed. Inscriptions were rewritten. But erasing his image did not erase his lesson. If Nero used fire to distract, and Caligula used comedy to destabilize, and Domitian used silence to choke the city, Commodus revealed the most dangerous possibility of all. What happens when an empire forgets that its ruler is supposed to govern, and begins treating him as a spectacle instead? Because after Commodus fell, Rome faced a question it could no longer dodge. Had torture become the empire's identity? rather than its tool. The next part will confront the aftermath of these reigns and the political psychology they left behind. When Commodus's body hit the floor of his chamber, strangled by the very performer meant to amuse him, Rome was not liberated. Rome was exposed. His death didn't reveal how one man had corrupted the empire. It revealed how the empire had allowed 4 men, Nero, Caligula, Domitian, Commodus, to normalize savagery so thoroughly that brutality no longer belonged to individuals. It belonged to the state. To understand the political psychology of this moment, imagine Rome in the first days after Commodus's assassination. Senators celebrating openly as if a curse had lifted. Crowds relieved, whispering that the gods had finally intervened. The Praetorian Guard repositioning itself to choose the next emperor. At first glance, it appears like a return to order. But beneath that surface, something colder moved. Rome was not reacting to a tyrant's fall. Rome was reacting to its own reflection, because Nero's spectacles had taught the city to crave theatrics. Caligula's volatility had taught the city to expect absurdity. Domitian's silences had taught the city to accept paranoia. And Commodus's performances had taught the city to applaud violence. The empire was no longer shocked by cruelty, it was conditioned by it. This is the hidden continuity that ancient historians often downplay. Although each emperor ruled differently, their reigns formed a psychological sequence that redefined Roman governance. After nearly half a century of engineered terror, the public no longer measured emperors by virtue. They measured them by how dangerous they might become. This shift had 3 profound consequences. Under the Republic, Romans feared external enemies. Under the early empire, they feared imperial collapse. But after these 4 emperors, Romans feared one another. Informers, delatores, did not disappear after Domitian. They multiplied. The bureaucratic networks that once fed accusations into Domitian's interrogation rooms now fed them into the courts, the palace, the treasury, and the marketplace. A whisper could still kill. A gesture could still condemn. Fear survived the tyrant because it no longer required a tyrant. It required only the memory of one. Rome's political class learned the safest strategy: obedience without conviction, speech without content, silence without safety. Modern viewers imagine cruelty as spontaneous, a tyrant losing control, screaming commands. But Rome's cruelty was documented, audited, budgeted. Arena spectacles under Nero generated expense lists. Caligula's executions created property seizures. Domitian's interrogations produced reports. Commodus's games required massive provisioning of animals, prisoners, armor, trainers, guards. Rome had built an infrastructure around pain. Once created, that infrastructure did not vanish. It needed funding. It needed staff. It needed duties, promotions, routines. It lodged itself into the skeleton of the imperial state. A bureaucracy designed to manage torture does not dissolve. It adapts. And after Commodus, it adapted to new emperors, new crises, new opportunities. Perhaps the most corrosive legacy of these emperors is not the violence itself, but the exhaustion it produced. Romans did not rise against Nero, Caligula, Domitian, or Commodus out of moral outrage. They rose one by one, out of survival instinct. And yet each fall left the same imprint: a growing belief that cruelty was inevitable. When a population believes suffering is unavoidable, resistance evaporates. people focus on minimizing danger rather than changing systems. They stop imagining alternatives. And when imagination dies, tyranny becomes permanent. That is the Rome Commodus left behind. But there was another element, subtle, invisible, but decisive: the economy of cruelty. Cruelty was not just political, it was profitable. Property confiscated from executed senators flowed into the imperial treasury. Arena vendors sold food, weapons, and animals. Craftsmen forged torture implements, armor, and restraints. Executioners, guards, beast handlers, and trainers earned wages from blood. Pain circulated as currency. So when Commodus died, Rome faced a dilemma with no precedent. Could the empire survive without cruelty, when cruelty had become one of its largest industries? This question was not asked aloud, because it could not be. But it shaped every political decision in the years that followed. Even emperors who sought restraint found themselves presiding over a system built by violence. Ending the cruelty meant dismantling the very structures that the empire relied upon for unity, revenue, and control. This is why the Senate immediately sought to erase Domitian and Commodus through damnatio memoriae, the symbolic ritual of obliteration. It was not justice, it was denial. If the images were gone, perhaps the system would feel less present. But people do not forget what silence, spectacle, and mockery taught them. Trauma does not disappear when a statue falls. Which leads us into the next stage of our investigation, the core of Act 2. If cruelty had become a system, what did Roman law look like under that system? Because beneath the arena, beneath the palaces, beneath the fires and feasts, a legal order was still functioning. And that legal order, the rules, the trials, the punishments, reveals something even more disturbing. The empire didn't just tolerate cruelty. The empire rationalized it. To understand that transformation, we must turn to the institution that outlived all four emperors, Roman law itself. When people imagine Rome's cruelty, they picture the arena. Sand soaked with blood, the crowd roaring, the emperor watching. But the most terrifying violence in the empire did not happen in front of tens of thousands. It happened in offices, archives, courtrooms, and private chambers. Because Rome did not merely permit brutality, Rome legalized it. If parts 1 to 6 revealed who inflicted cruelty, Part 7 exposes how the empire justified it, because cruelty, to endure, must eventually stop being shock and start being procedure. After Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus, Rome faced a paradox. It wanted to condemn tyrants, yet it relied on the very judicial and administrative mechanisms those tyrants had strengthened. The system needed to function. So, the system adapted. Violence became part of the paperwork. The most powerful legal tool in Rome was maiestas, the crime of treason. Under the Republic, it meant harming the state. Under the early empire, it meant insulting the emperor. But after our four tyrants, the definition expanded beyond recognition. A raised eyebrow could imply disloyalty. A pause before greeting the emperor could signal sedition. A rumor, a dream, a metaphor. These became legal evidence. In Domitian's reign, silence itself had been dangerous. Under later emperors, the memory of Domitian made caution permanent. Treason trials did not stop with his death. They became a refined ritual in which the accusation meant more than the outcome. Trials served to remind Rome that power was listening. And who delivered these accusations? Not just soldiers, not just officials. Ordinary citizens, delatores, who gained wealth, status, and immunity through denunciation. The state did not need to produce cruelty. It outsourced cruelty to the population. Once people learned that accusation was a path to advancement, Rome created a self-feeding machine. Fear generated denunciation. Denunciation generated trials. Trials generated property seizures, and property seizures funded the imperial treasury. Fear became revenue. Roman law had long allowed the torture of slaves for testimony. But after Nero, Caligula, and Domitian, this boundary collapsed. Torture was no longer a last resort. It was a standard investigative technique. Accused senators could be tortured. Nobles could be tortured. Women could be tortured. Foreigners could be tortured. Anyone who lacked a powerful patron could be tortured. And because torture created truth, it justified itself. If a man screamed a confession, the law considered the case proven. Pain turned into evidence, and evidence turned into verdict. The brilliance and horror of this system was that no emperor needed to micromanage it. The bureaucracy already understood the expectations. The mere memory of Nero's tortures and Domitian's interrogation rooms shaped every decision that came after. Rome had internalized cruelty. After the tyrants, emperors tried to distance themselves from overt sadism. But the Roman public had been conditioned. They expected spectacle. They demanded it. So the state offered a compromise. Not constant brutality. Not random brutality. Symbolic brutality. Executions became public rituals, reaffirming hierarchy. Crucifixions for rebels. Burnings for arsonists and treasonous slaves. Damnatio ad bestias. Condemnation to the beasts for those deemed enemies of the people. Strangulation or throat-cutting for elite offenders to preserve a facade of dignity. Each method of punishment communicated something about power. Rome's justice system didn't just discipline behavior, it educated the population about fear. The spectacle had become pedagogical. The genius of Rome's cruelty wasn't in its physical forms: crucifixion, burning, mutilation, flaying. The genius was in the system's ability to make the population police itself. Why rebel if rebellion leads to crucifixion on the roadside? Why criticize the emperor if criticism leads to disappearance? Why speak boldly if silence is safer? Why trust anyone if anyone can profit by accusing you? Rome discovered that the greatest torture device is uncertainty. A beast in the arena kills quickly. The law kills slowly. A man convicted of maiestas might wait months for his sentence. A woman accused of sacrilege might never know whether the trial would proceed. A slave tortured for testimony might never understand the questions being asked. Cruelty became psychological, fear became ambient, and silence became the empire's operating system. By now, we reach a disturbing truth. Rome could remove a tyrant, but Rome could not remove the logic of tyranny. Nero's blame machine, Caligula's humiliation theatre, Domitian's secret chambers, Commodus's gladiatorial narcissism. Each left behind administrative habits, legal precedents, and cultural expectations. These habits outlived their creators. They seeped into courtrooms, prisons, treasuries, and everyday speech. Rome had turned cruelty into a self-sustaining institution. which leads us to the central question that now shadows the rest of Act 2. What happens when a state creates a legal system that no longer needs a cruel emperor to function cruelly? Because the empire that survived these 4 men was not the empire that existed before them. It was harder, quieter, and more frightened. And soon, in Part 8, we will confront the consequence of a society conditioned by pain. What do people look like? How do they behave when brutality becomes normal? By the time Commodus fell and the Senate tried to sweep 4 reigns of savagery into the dust, Rome faced a truth too large to erase. An empire that watches cruelty long enough becomes shaped by it. Nero's burning gardens, Caligula's murderous laughter, Domitian's interrogations, and Commodus's arena performances were not isolated episodes. They were lessons. And the people learned them. This is the part of Roman history most documentaries avoid. It is safer to blame tyrants. It is harder to examine a population that applauded, adapted, benefited, or simply endured. But if we want to understand how the empire functioned, we must confront the citizens who lived inside the violence. Because cruelty does not transform a state without transforming its people. Romans did not merely witness cruelty, they consumed it. Arena games under Nero and Commodus were not mandatory attendance, yet tens of thousands poured in. Families brought children, vendors sold snacks. Poets wrote verses celebrating dramatic kills. For many Romans, the arena was not a horror, it was a holiday. Why? Because cruelty taught a simple social rule. As long as someone else is dying, you are safe. The arena created a psychological inversion. Instead of empathy, Romans learned hierarchy. The condemned were not individuals, they were categories: slaves, foreigners, criminals, Christians, political enemies, or anyone unlucky enough to be declared a threat to public order. Watching them die reaffirmed the viewer's place above them. Pain became reassurance. In a society where emperors killed on whims and treason laws could destroy anyone, seeing violence inflicted on another body was not merely entertainment, it was relief. Domitian's reign embedded a quieter, more corrosive adaptation: the normalization of silence. Romans learned to speak in coded phrases, to smile when frightened, to praise when disgusted, to listen before answering, to treat every stranger as a possible informer. This was not cowardice, it was survival. When torture becomes procedural, society becomes performative. By the time Commodus ascended, people no longer needed to be told to cheer. They understood instinctively that applause was safer than indifference. They had internalized the unspoken law: pretend long enough, and you might live longer. Cruelty in Rome employed people. It fed them. It gave them status. Beast handlers, trainers, executioners, carpenters building crosses, scribes recording interrogations, guards dragging prisoners, doctors treating gladiatorial wounds, butchers supplying animals, merchants selling chains, whip makers, armorers. Thousands earned their wages from suffering. When an industry grows from violence, violence becomes harder to abolish. Rome's cruelty was profitable. That means Rome's cruelty was protected. A man whose income depended on the arena did not question the arena. A woman selling refreshments at executions did not protest executions. A clerk rewarded for recording confessions did not oppose torture. Violence had shareholders. Imperial cruelty sharpened Rome's internal divisions. Pain was distributed by rank. Slaves were tortured for testimony. Foreigners were thrown to beasts. The poor suffered public punishments. The wealthy suffered forced suicides. Women suffered humiliation. Men suffered execution. Each group had its own place on the pyramid of suffering, and Romans understood this structure intimately. It became a map of the social world. Everyone knew who stood above whom and who could be sacrificed. This is the moral cost of a hierarchical society. Cruelty becomes predictable, rationalized, and then expected. Perhaps the most tragic adaptation was not joy or fear, but indifference. By the time Domitian's silent chambers and Commodus's arena fantasies became public knowledge, Romans simply absorbed it. They discussed cruelty the way modern societies discuss weather, taxes, or currency fluctuations. Something to note, not to oppose. You cannot resist what you have normalized. You cannot mourn what you never valued. This is why the Senate's attempt to erase the tyrants did nothing. Rome could smash statues, rename months, or condemn memories. But you cannot legislate away a psychology. For decades, Romans had been trained to expect cruelty, to tolerate it, to live within it. That conditioning did not evaporate when Commodus died. The deepest consequence of this conditioning is philosophical. Rome no longer shared a common definition of justice. Justice under Nero meant obedience. Justice under Caligula meant amusement. Justice under Domitian meant silence. Justice under Commodus meant spectacle. These frameworks clashed, overlapped, combined, dissolved. The result was a population that knew what to fear, but not what to believe. A state can survive poverty. A state can survive invasion. But a state cannot survive moral fragmentation. When no one agrees on what is right, the only remaining compass is force. And force was the only compass Rome had left. So now we arrive at the central tension driving the empire toward its next crisis. If cruelty had shaped the emperors and shaped the people, what shape did it leave on the empire itself? Not just politically, not just legally, but structurally. What does an empire look like after it has made pain ordinary? To answer that, in Part 9, we must examine the very machinery Rome used to sustain itself after the age of sadistic emperors. The institutions, the military, the economy, and the myth of Roman order. Because the empire that emerged from Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus was not a battered Rome. It was a Rome that had learned to live without a conscience. By the time the dust settled after Commodus's strangulation, Rome was not simply traumatized, it was transformed. The people had adapted to cruelty, yes. But now we confront the deeper mutation. Rome's institutions, legal, military, administrative, and economic, had adapted as well. An empire's cruelty becomes truly permanent only when it no longer depends on cruel individuals. And after Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus, Rome no longer required tyrants to function tyrannically. The system had absorbed their methods. Each of the 4 emperors redefined the imperial role. Nero made the emperor a performer. Caligula made the emperor a god of mockery. Domitian made the emperor an invisible judge. Commodus made the emperor a gladiator. After their deaths, Rome tried to restore the old ideal, the emperor as a rational guardian of the state. But political memory could not be erased. Every new ruler inherited an office swollen by fear, spectacle, and discretionary violence. The Senate no longer expected virtue. The people no longer expected stability. The Praetorian Guard no longer expected loyalty. Everyone expected danger. This meant even good emperors had to rule within a structure already reshaped by terror, where silence was safer than dissent, where executions were administrative tools, where the emperor's personality was a matter of public security. The office remained poisoned long after the tyrants were gone. The Senate had once been the moral spine of the Republic. After these reigns, it was a skeleton. Nero humiliated senators publicly. Caligula killed them for amusement. Domitian terrorized them privately. Commodus ignored them entirely. The result? Senators became specialists in survival. They learned to read silences, flatter instinctively, praise strategically. Decision-making decayed. Debate evaporated. The Senate existed, but only in ceremonial form. By the late 2nd century, it no longer even pretended to govern. It merely waited for orders, waited for danger, waited for a new emperor to either tolerate or destroy it. An institution that lives in fear cannot function. An institution that performs obedience cannot lead. The Senate was alive, but no longer living. While the Senate weakened, the military strengthened, but not in a way that rebuilt Rome. Instead, it absorbed the imperial logic of domination. Nero used the Praetorian Guard to eliminate rivals. Caligula used them as props in his theatre of horror. Domitian used them as secret police. Commodus used them to protect the audience from himself. By the time Commodus fell, the Guard had learned the ultimate imperial lesson. If the emperor can kill without reason, so can we. Loyalty became transactional. Corruption became structural. Assassination became policy. The army learned that it could make emperors and unmake them. Emperors learned to fear their own protectors, and the empire entered the age of what historians call barracks emperors, where soldiers, not institutions, determined succession. Cruelty had democratized, but only within the military elite. Every act of imperial cruelty generated economic consequences. Arena games stimulated entire commercial ecosystems. Treason trials produced property seizures. Informers earned bounties. Executioners, handlers, and torturers earned wages. Confiscations filled treasury gaps. In other words, pain funded the state. But the economic legacy was even more insidious. Cruelty destabilized long-term planning. No senator invested in urban projects if he feared execution. No wealthy family donated to temples if confiscation was likely. No merchant expanded trade if the emperor's demands were unpredictable. Rome became a short-term empire, reactive, anxious, and dependent on rituals of brutality to maintain public attention and political cohesion. The empire's economy survived, but it lost its capacity to imagine the future. Roman courts became increasingly efficient at one thing: conviction. Not justice, not arbitration, not protection, conviction. The legal precedents set by Nero and Domitian made it easy for later emperors to punish with minimal scrutiny. Courts no longer mediated conflict, they processed enemies. Sentences became predictable. Crucifixions, burnings, arena condemnations, forced suicides. Law became the emperor's shadow. The biggest casualty of the sadistic emperors was Rome's self-image. Romans had believed their empire represented order, law, civilization, rationality, and virtue. But after half a century of theatrical horror and bureaucratic terror, that myth cracked. What replaced it? A hollowed-out ideology. A sense of grandeur without substance. A performance of unity that concealed fragmentation. A population united only by fear and spectacle. Rome remained powerful, but power had lost meaning. This is why historians often describe the 2nd century as a golden age, because the marble still shone, the roads still stretched across continents, the temples still stood tall. But beneath all that infrastructure pulsed a psychological truth. Rome no longer believed in itself. Rome endured by momentum, not conviction. Now we stand at the threshold of Act 3. We have examined the emperors, the law, the people, and the institutions. We have witnessed how cruelty seeped into every layer of Roman life. The final question remains. If cruelty became Rome's political identity, how did Rome explain itself to the world and to itself? In Part 10, we confront the philosophical reckoning, the empire's attempt to reclaim legitimacy after its most sadistic rulers, and the dark truth that emerged when it tried. When Commodus died, Rome attempted something it had already attempted 3 times before: reinvention. The Senate rushed to condemn him. Statues were smashed, names erased, edicts reversed. Historians call this process damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. But its psychological function was simpler. Erase the tyrant, pretend the system is innocent. But after Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus, this ritual no longer worked. Rome kept killing the emperor, but Rome never killed the conditions that produced him. And so, each assassination felt less like a cure and more like a reset button on a corrupted machine. To understand why, we must examine how the empire tried to restore legitimacy, and why every attempt failed. After each sadistic reign, Rome imagined the next ruler as a corrective. After Caligula, Claudius, the scholar. After Nero, Vespasian, the soldier administrator. After Domitian, Nerva, the gentle elder statesman. After Commodus, Pertinax, the disciplined reformer. These men were not tyrants. Many were competent. Some were noble. But they inherited a throne soaked in fear, a senate trained for obedience, a military trained for opportunism, and a population trained for spectacle. No amount of personal virtue could cancel institutional trauma. A good emperor could rule decently. He could not unteach fear. He could not unbuild the bureaucracy of cruelty. He could not erase the memory of torches, chambers, or arenas. Rome wanted morality, but it had built machinery. The gulf between the two was vast. Destroying a statue destroys stone, not structure. Erasing a name erases ink, not precedent. When the Senate condemned Nero's memory, his architecture of spectacle survived. When they condemned Domitian, his treason apparatus survived. When they condemned Commodus, his arena economy survived. Memory was not the problem, procedure was the problem. But Rome, unwilling to confront its own complicity, treated tyranny as a bad emperor problem. The Senate blamed the individual. The people blamed the gods. The army blamed misfortune. No one blamed the system. So the system remained. Each correction emperor attempted reforms. Claudius strengthened bureaucracy. Vespasian rebuilt finances. Nerva curbed executions. Pertinax tried to tame the Praetorian Guard. But reforms collapsed for the same reason. The system had learned to protect cruelty. The Praetorian Guard assassinated emperors who threatened its privileges. The Senate feared confrontation more than decline. The people preferred spectacle to austerity. The provincial governors preferred status quo to scrutiny. Cruelty was not an aberration. It was a stabilizing force. It kept the poor distracted. It kept the elites obedient. It kept the army fed. It kept the emperor feared. Reform was fragile. Fear was reliable. Rome chose reliability. Here lies the deeper tragedy. Rome told itself it was founded on law. Rome told itself it was governed by reason. Rome told itself it was the bringer of civilization. But Nero burned people alive for ambiance. Caligula murdered for amusement. Domitian punished silence. Commodus demanded applause while killing bound men. These were not footnotes. These were the pillars of governance. By the 2nd century, Rome's self-image had fractured into two incompatible stories: the Rome of marble, order, and philosophy; the Rome of torches, laughter, whispers, and blood. The empire lived inside that contradiction. Roman philosophers tried to rescue its dignity. Stoics argued for virtue. Jurists argued for justice. Senators argued for restoration. But the people had seen too much. The institutions had adapted too deeply. Cruelty had become too normal. No rhetoric could reconcile the empire with its own behavior. After the age of sadistic emperors, Rome shifted emotionally, not toward rebellion, not toward reform, toward cynicism. The population no longer believed in moral leadership. The Senate no longer believed in its authority. The army no longer believed in loyalty. Even emperors no longer believed in restraint. Cynicism replaced civic virtue. Pragmatism replaced justice. Survival replaced ethics. This emotional shift is what ultimately doomed the empire. Not barbarian invasions, not financial strain, not political instability. Those were symptoms. The disease was indifference. A civilization that stops believing in its own principles cannot sustain itself. A government that teaches its people to expect cruelty cannot govern without it. An institution that relies on fear cannot inspire loyalty. Rome had become an empire that feared itself. So here we stand with the tyrants dead and Rome trying desperately to feel clean again. But cleansing rituals do not erase structural truth. Statues fall, systems endure. Which brings us to the crucial question guiding the end of Act 3. If Rome could not restore its moral center, what did cruelty leave behind? What was the long-term legacy of an empire governed by pain, fear, and performance? In Part 11, we confront that legacy, not in individuals, not in institutions, but in the very philosophy of power that Rome exported into the world. By the time Rome finished purging the memories of Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus, the empire had reached a paradox that no decree could resolve. It wanted moral authority, but it had built its authority on fear. This contradiction wasn't political. It wasn't administrative. It was philosophical. Because the sadistic emperors didn't just scar Rome, they rewrote its definition of power. Rome had once believed power was the capacity to uphold law, protect borders, reward virtue, punish corruption, and maintain peace. But after half a century of emperors who used torture as theatre, humiliation as governance, silence as policy, and spectacle as identity, power had acquired a new meaning. Power was the ability to inflict pain without consequence. This definition seeped into every part of Roman life. It survived every assassination. It outlived the men who embodied it. And it formed the invisible architecture holding the empire together long after the flames of the Colosseum dimmed. Nero's reign introduced a principle Rome never abandoned. If people see you inflict pain, they will believe in your power. This is the logic of the arena, dragged into politics. It's the logic of public executions disguised as festivals. It's the logic of imperial presence itself. Golden thrones, triumphal processions, lavish banquets, and torches burning human beings. Nero understood the psychological shortcut. Spectacle replaces legitimacy. Future emperors absorbed the lesson. Even those who despised Nero's excess relied on spectacle to maintain authority. Why? Because spectacle demands nothing from the spectator, only awe. It's easy, it's effective, and it avoids accountability. Caligula sharpened that principle by adding another. If you can make a man degrade himself, you own him. Caligula's laughter wasn't madness, it was philosophy. Humiliation destroys dignity, faster than violence. Humiliation makes obedience self-inflicted. Humiliation turns subjects into participants. By forcing senators to watch executions, by mocking nobles publicly, by turning elite families into playthings, Caligula understood something chilling. A humiliated population doesn't resist. It rationalizes. This principle outlived him. Domitian internalized it. Commodus inverted it. Later emperors institutionalized it through legal procedures that required public submission. Humiliation had become a political technology. Domitian contributed the most enduring principle. Fear does not need to be seen to function. Silence is cheaper than spectacle. Silence is more efficient than terror. Silence transforms society from within. When people censor themselves, the emperor no longer needs to punish them. When citizens distrust one another, the emperor no longer needs informers. When the wealthy fear confiscation, the emperor no longer needs trials. Domitian invented the politics of the quiet room, the unseen chamber, the closed-door interrogation. This became Rome's default mode of governance. Not because later emperors wanted to imitate Domitian, but because silence requires no talent, no charisma, no cruelty, only the memory of cruelty. Silence became the empire's real constitution. And then Commodus added the final, catastrophic principle. Power does not need dignity, it needs applause. Commodus ruled like a living metaphor, an emperor who stepped into the arena and forced Rome to cheer as he struck down the helpless. He taught Rome that authority could be hollow as long as it was loud, that legitimacy could be replaced with entertainment, that governance could be replaced with performance. In the long arc of history, Commodus's legacy was the most corrosive. He shifted Rome from a civilization to a spectacle, from a state to a stage, from politics to performance art. And once an empire becomes a stage, its rulers become actors. Actors who must escalate, exaggerate, and intensify to maintain relevance. Commodus was assassinated, but the idea he embodied did not die. After them, Rome possessed a spectacle without morality, a silence without safety, a bureaucracy without conscience, a population without ideals, A ruling class without conviction. The result? A power structure that required constant fear to remain stable, not because any emperor demanded it, but because the system no longer understood any other language. Fear had become Rome's currency, Rome's glue, Rome's logic, Rome's philosophy of governance. This was the legacy of the most sadistic emperors. They converted cruelty into a political doctrine. So now, as we approach the final part of Act 3, we confront the unavoidable truth. Rome tried to erase the monsters. Rome tried to glorify the marble. Rome tried to rebuild dignity. But Rome never answered the real question. What kind of empire does a society become once it has learned that pain, humiliation, spectacle, and silence are the 4 pillars of power? In Part 12, we face the final reckoning, not about Nero, Caligula, Domitian, or Commodus, but about the Rome that survived them. For 11 parts, we traced Nero's flames, Caligula's laughter, Domitian's silence, and Commodus's blood-soaked vanity. But the final reckoning does not belong to the emperors. It belongs to the empire that produced them, and the empire that survived them. Because the big question that opened this investigation was not about the emperors themselves. How did Rome transform cruelty from an aberration into a political system that replaced law with fear? To answer that, we must turn from biography to structure, from individuals to ideology. Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus were symptoms. The disease was older and deeper. Rome believed power was strongest when it controlled pain. Everything else, the law, the army, the treasury, the theatre, the temples, served that belief. When Nero burned prisoners as torches, he was not inventing Roman cruelty. He was intensifying an existing logic. When Caligula mocked senators and murdered for amusement, he was not rejecting tradition. He was exposing it. When Domitian weaponized silence, he didn't deform justice. He completed its evolution. And when Commodus turned the arena into the imperial stage, he didn't degrade Rome's image. He revealed it. The empire's rulers did not twist Rome's moral core. They revealed its moral core. Roman historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, often portray the tyrants as aberrations, interrupting a noble system. But this was the system. An empire that conquered through crucifixions, enslavement, and mass execution was always going to embrace cruelty internally. The arena did not corrupt Rome. The arena was Rome. The interrogation chamber did not darken Roman justice. It clarified it. Crucifixion, burning, throat-cutting, beast mauling. These were not emergencies. They were public policy. They were lessons. They were the grammar of authority. Rome survived tyrants because Rome was built to absorb tyranny. Rome kept meticulous records. Grain shipments, tax receipts, military rosters, building accounts, imperial expenditures. But the real ledger of the empire, the one that reveals its priorities, was written in other materials. In ash, in bone, in scars, in the silence of missing names, in the trauma of crowds that learned to cheer for blood, in the fear of citizens who learned to whisper their thoughts. This ledger does not lie. It shows that power in Rome was not sustained by law, nor by tradition, nor by reason. It was sustained by ritualized harm. Cruelty was not an accident. Cruelty was infrastructure. The saddest truth is that Rome exported its philosophy of power. Centuries later, empires would imitate. Its spectacles of punishment, its bureaucratized violence, its hierarchy of suffering, its fusion of entertainment and death, its belief that authority requires display. Rome did not just conquer land. Rome conquered the imagination. When states today parade military force, they echo Nero. When leaders humiliate rivals publicly, they echo Caligula. When governments justify secrecy and surveillance as security, they echo Domitian. When politics becomes performance, demanding applause rather than competence, they echo Commodus. Rome still lives in the way power is staged. So how did Rome transform cruelty into a system that replaced law with fear? Because cruelty solved problems that law could not. Fear was faster than courts. Spectacle was more persuasive than decrees. Humiliation was more efficient than philosophy. Silence was more stable than debate. Violence was more reliable than virtue. Rome did not choose cruelty because it was monstrous. Rome chose cruelty because it worked. The empire built on roads, aqueducts, engineering, and law chose pain as its political foundation because pain never argues, never hesitates, never rebels. Pain obeys. But the cost of building a civilization on pain is simple. When pain becomes the logic of power, power eventually becomes the logic of ruin. If you walk the ruins of the Colosseum today, you will see arches, corridors, stone bleachers, the skeletal geometry of empire. But beneath the stone lies a truth we have excavated across these 12 parts. Rome did not collapse because it was weak. Rome collapsed because it believed terror was strength. Its monuments were tall, its armies were vast, its laws were intricate, its culture was rich, but its soul was exhausted. A civilization can endure poverty, invasion, plague, and instability. But no civilization can endure the conviction that cruelty is its most reliable institution. Nero lit the gardens with burning bodies. Caligula laughed while men died. Domitian listened to screams behind closed doors. Commodus demanded applause as he murdered in the arena. But when the ledger finally closed, none of their performances remained. Only the bones remained. And the bones still speak.